There is a question that the inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus keep locked behind more seals than almost any other question in their long and terrible catalogue of forbidden knowledge. It is not a question about the nature of the warp, though that question is dangerous enough. It is not a question about the true history of the Horus heresy, though that history is dark enough. The question is smaller than either of those, and somehow more frightening precisely because of its smallness. The question is this: of all the Space Marine chapters that have served the Emperor of mankind since the great restructuring of the legions after the heresy, which one has done the most to hide its past from the Imperium it claims to serve? Which chapter, when asked directly about the darkest chapter of its history, will change the subject with the practiced ease of a being that has been changing this particular subject for 10,000 years? The answer is not a traitor legion. The answer is not some renegade chapter that slipped into heresy centuries after the heresy ended and has been doing damage control ever since. The answer is the Dark Angels, the First Legion, the oldest and once perhaps the greatest of all the Emperor's legions. The answer is the chapter that traces its lineage directly to the Primarch who was, by the accounts of most who knew him, the single most strategically gifted being that the Great Crusade produced. The answer is a chapter that has spent 10,000 years in the service of the Emperor, fighting his enemies with a ferocity and dedication that no honest observer could question, and that has also spent those same 10,000 years keeping a secret so large and so dark that the keeping of it has over the millennia become inseparable from what the Dark Angels are. To understand the secret, you need to understand Caliban, and to understand Caliban, you need to set aside everything you think you know about what a Space Marine homeworld looks like, because Caliban does not fit the template. It was not a world of ice and wolves like Fenris. It was not a world of deserts and trial like Baal. It was not an ash-choked forge like so many of the recruiting worlds that the legions came to depend on. Caliban was a forest, an ancient, impenetrable, continent-spanning forest so dense that even at midday the sunlight barely reached the ground in most of its depths. The trees were old in a way that trees on other worlds are not old, their trunks wider than houses, their bark dark and strange, their roots tangling together beneath the soil in patterns that the planet's earliest inhabitants believed were writing, though nobody could agree on what language or what message. The forest was not simply old. The forest was dangerous in ways that went beyond the ordinary hazards of an untamed wilderness. The creatures that lived in it, the things called the great beasts that the people of Caliban had been fighting for as long as memory reached, were not simply large predators. They were wrong. That is the word that appears most consistently in the oldest records of Caliban that have been preserved. Wrong. Their biology was wrong. Their behaviors were wrong. Their presence in a place was wrong in ways that the scholarly tradition of the Mechanicus would eventually, many centuries later, associate with low-level warp contamination of the kind that accumulates in places old enough and isolated enough and dark enough. Caliban had been cut off from the rest of humanity during the Age of Strife, and in that isolation something had crept in from the Imperium and touched the deep roots of the world's ecology. The people of Caliban had been dealing with this for generations before the Primarch fell from the sky. They had developed, in response, a culture of warrior monks, trained fighting orders that combined the skills of hunters and soldiers with the disciplines of scholars and mystics. Because fighting the great beasts required both. The orders, as they were called, were the most significant social institution on Caliban. They were its nobility, its military, its intellectual class. A boy who was accepted into one of the orders was being given everything that a life on Caliban could offer. He was being given purpose and training and brotherhood and the prospect of a death that mattered, which on a world where most deaths did not matter was worth more than it sounds. The man who led the most significant of these orders was named Luther. He was, by any measure available to the people of Caliban, exceptional. He was a natural leader in the specific sense that means his followers would go anywhere he pointed and do anything he asked without needing to understand the reason, because they trusted him completely. He was a fighter of considerable skill and a thinker of genuine depth, a combination that the orders valued above individual excellence in either discipline alone. He was also, which the later record tends to forget because of what came after, genuinely good. Not good in the soft way of men who have never been tested. Good in the hard way of men who know what evil looks like. Because they have spent their lives fighting it in the literal form of things that came out of the dark forest to kill the people in their care, and who have chosen, despite everything, to remain decent. Luther was the master of the Order of Caliban when the child who would become the lion was found. And this is where the story becomes the kind of story that sounds like myth, because it actually is a kind of myth. The kind of myth that happens to also be true. An infant, or something that looked like an infant, was found in the deep forest. Not near a settlement, not near any path that any reasonable person would travel. In the deep forest, where nothing human survived. Where this child had apparently been living, alone, for years. He was perhaps 10 years old when Luther's knights found him. He could not speak any language. He wore no clothes. He had, as far as anyone could determine, been surviving in the most dangerous environment, on the most dangerous world in the known region, by some combination of extraordinary physical capability and instincts that went considerably beyond what any human child should have possessed. Luther took him in. This is the decision that the later history of the Dark Angels rotates around. And it is important to understand that it was not a complicated decision at the time. It was an act of compassion, extended toward an extraordinary child by a man who recognized extraordinary things when he saw them. Luther named the child Johnson, as was the tradition of the order for foundlings, and began the process of educating him in the ways of his new world. What followed was a transformation of the kind that seems, in retrospect, inevitable, and which in the moment simply seemed astonishing. The child learned language in weeks, not months. He absorbed the order's accumulated knowledge of combat and tactics and strategy with a speed that left his teachers with nothing left to teach within years. He grew rapidly, not in the slow, steady way of ordinary children, but in sudden jumps, as though his body were periodically remembering what it was supposed to be and compensating for time lost. Within a decade, he was the most capable warrior on Caliban. Within 2 decades, he had given himself the name that history would know him by: Lion L. Johnson. Luther was proud of him. This is important. Luther was genuinely proud of the being he had taken in and helped shape, in the way that a mentor is proud of a student who has exceeded every expectation, the way that a surrogate father is proud of a son who has become more than the father imagined. This pride was not competitive or diminished by the recognition that the lion had surpassed. It was the cleaner, more generous kind of pride that requires a certain quality of character to sustain. Luther was good enough to simply be glad that the lion existed, and that he had been part of making him who he was. And then the lion revealed what he was. Not through drama or announcement, through action, which was always his preferred form of he began hunting the great beasts with an effectiveness that the orders had never achieved. Not cautiously, not with the carefully planned campaigns of attrition that the warrior monks had developed over generations. He hunted them as though he already knew where they were, as though the patterns of the deep forest were legible to him in ways they were not legible to anyone else. As though the wrongness that the beasts carried was not a source of dread but a signal he could read. One by one, and then in great sweeping campaigns of purification, he cleared the forest. The beasts that had defined Caliban's peril for as long as anyone could remember were destroyed. Not over decades, but within years. The forest, cleared of what had contaminated it, began slowly to change. The darkness of it remained. Because the darkness was structural. But the malevolence that had sat beneath the darkness, the wrongness in the deep roots, receded as the beasts were extinguished. The lion had done in years what Caliban's warrior culture had been failing to do for generations, and in doing it, he had become what the warrior culture had always theoretically been pointing toward, the one being on Caliban who was genuinely qualified to lead all of its orders, not because he had claimed the title or been given it, but because he had demonstrated, in terms that admitted no argument, that he was more than anything else the world had produced. Luther gave up his authority to the lion. He did so freely, without resentment, with the clear-eyed understanding that the extraordinary thing he had helped create was now something the world needed more than it needed Luther's particular capabilities. He became, in the new order of things, the lion's second. Not a subordinate in the diminished sense, not a lieutenant who carries out orders from above, but the second most important person on Caliban. Someone whose counsel the lion valued, and whose presence gave the enterprise of the renewed Calibanite civilization a human warmth that the lion, brilliant and cold and unable to express his feelings in any conventional way, could not provide himself. They were not the same kind of being, and this mattered. The lion was what he was. Something outside the ordinary human scale in ways that went beyond his physical capabilities. He had emerged from the forest already partly formed in a way that the people of Caliban could not fully account for. His strategic genius was real, and it was extraordinary. His commitment to Caliban's people was real. His eventual loyalty to the emperor would be real, but his capacity to show people what he felt about them was limited in ways that caused consequences none of them could foresee. He could lead. He could inspire. In a cold, awesome way. He could not easily tell the people he cared about that he cared about them. He could not easily communicate trust. He could demonstrate it through action. And he did. But the demonstration was not always legible to the people it was intended for. This is not a character flaw in the conventional sense. It is a quality that in a being of the lion's capability and authority had the weight of a structural feature, a load-bearing element whose absence would eventually bring something down. The emperor arrived on Caliban at the height of the lion's achievement, and the recognition that passed between father and son was immediate. Not warm, perhaps. Warmth was not something either of them was particularly equipped to perform, but genuine. The emperor saw in the lion what he had always hoped he would see, the actualization of the most ambitious aspects of his gene crafting, a being of absolute strategic clarity and total physical capability whose loyalty, once given, would be absolute. The lion saw in the Emperor the explanation for everything he had always known about himself, without being able to name it. The missing context. The father-shaped space that his years in the forest had left in the architecture of his self. Caliban's warriors were taken into the First Legion. Most of Luther's order, the brothers with whom he had fought the great beasts and built the renewed civilization of their world, became Space Marines, transformed through the genocide that bore the lion's biological legacy and the hypno-conditioning that shaped them into the Emperor's servants. Not all of them survived the transformation. The survival rate for aspirants from Caliban was, by the accounts that survive, lower than many other legions. The process was brutal in ways that the Calibanite warrior tradition was not quite sufficient preparation for, and the losses were real and felt by the warriors who watched their brothers not wake from the final stages of the procedure. But Luther survived. Luther he was augmented, given the full suite of enhancements that the genocide and the process provided, raised to the superhuman physical capability that being a Space Marine implied. He was not as extraordinary as the lion in the way that no one was as extraordinary as the lion. But he was more than he had been. And he was still the second, still the lion's partner and counselor, still the human face of the First Legion that the lion's cold brilliance required as a counterpart. Their partnership continued. It continued through the early campaigns of the Great Crusade, when the First Legion went to war and found it was very, very good at war, in a particular kind of way that set it apart from its brother legions. The First Legion fought with secrets the way other legions fought with weapons, not in the sense of dishonesty or deception within the legion itself, but in the sense of information control as a strategic doctrine. The Dark Angels, as they had come to be called, the name having emerged from the campaigns of Caliban's cleared forest, were masters of knowing things they did not share. Their intelligence networks were extensive and carefully maintained. Their operations frequently produced outcomes that other legions could not fully account for, because the Dark Angels had information that the other legions did not. Information that had been gathered, processed, and acted upon through mechanisms that the First Legion considered proprietary and treated accordingly. The lion did not explain his methods to his brother Primarchs if explaining them was not. He did not share intelligence if sharing it would compromise its source. He trusted his own judgment about what other people needed to know, and that judgment was very often correct. And the fact that it was very often correct did not make the other Primarchs less uncomfortable with being told only as much as the lion had decided they required. It is worth dwelling on this, because the operational culture that the lion built in the First Legion is the direct ancestor of the culture that the Dark Angels maintained 10,000 years later. The secrecy was not a corruption. It was not something that happened to the First Legion or was imposed on it by external forces. It was a chosen approach, deliberately cultivated by their Primarch, who had grown up in the deep forest learning that information about what was in the dark was the difference between survival and death, and who had translated that lesson into a strategic philosophy that made his legion extraordinarily effective and also extraordinarily opaque. The secrecy was a virtue, and then it was a habit, and then it was something that the legion could not entirely separate from its identity, which meant that when the secret became something genuinely terrible rather than simply strategically sensitive, the habit of keeping it was already deeply embedded in every warrior the Legion had. The First Legion fought across the Great Crusade. They fought brilliantly. The Lion waged war with a systematic, patient precision that achieved outcomes other legions achieved through overwhelming force. but achieved them with fewer casualties and less collateral destruction, because he understood the geometry of conflict in ways that most of his brothers did not. He was not beloved by the other Primarchs in the way that Horus was beloved, or admired in the open-hearted way that Sanguinius was admired. He was respected, which is a different and in some ways more durable thing. The Primarchs who had fought alongside him knew that he was remarkable. They were also frequently annoyed by him, which he accepted as a reasonable price for maintaining the operational security that he considered necessary. Luther fought beside him. For a time. For longer than what the later history sometimes implies. Their partnership survived the early years of the Crusade, survived campaigns on dozens, survived the accumulated stress of sustained military operations that would have broken the bonds between less genuinely connected beings. But the Great Crusade was long, and logistics are relentless in what they require of enormous military operations. And somewhere in the vast machinery of the advancing crusade, a decision was made that would prove, in retrospect, to be the hinge on which the First Legion's entire future turned. Luther was sent back to Caliban. The decision to send Luther back to Caliban was presented at the time as a practical one. Caliban needed administration. The home world of the First Legion needed someone to oversee recruitment, to manage the training of new aspirants, to maintain the institutions that the Lion had built and that the Crusade's momentum required to keep functioning. The role was important. Somebody capable had to fill it. Luther was capable, more capable than almost anyone else available. These things were true. The practical case for the decision was sound. But there was something else present in the decision. Something that the practical case either obscured or that the Lion genuinely did not recognize in himself. Luther had been injured. The nature of the injury varies slightly between the accounts that have been preserved, but the consistent element is that it was significant, that it threatened to affect his capability in ways that an active combat role on a frontline operation could not accommodate. And the Lion, whose relationship to vulnerability in those he commanded was complex and not entirely developed, handled this the way he handled most things that required him to communicate a difficult truth to someone he cared about. He handled it through action rather than words. He arranged for Luther to be given important work away from the front rather than explaining that the front was no longer the right place for him. Whether Luther knew at some level that there was more to it than the practical case. Whether the Lion intended any slight, consciously or otherwise. Whether the decision was a practical necessity that Luther's pride made impossible for him to receive correctly, or a genuine expression of the Lion's inability to communicate directly with the people he trusted most. These questions are not answerable from the outside, and they are perhaps not answerable from the inside either. What is answerable is what happened as a result. Luther went to Caliban. He went as the Lion's appointed representative, with considerable authority and genuine responsibilities. He went with warriors of the First Legion who had been assigned to support the homeworld's defense and administration. He went in every official sense as an honored deputy rather than a sidelined subordinate. And he found, as the months of absence extended into years, and the years into longer periods as the Crusade consumed the Lion's attention across distant systems, that the gap between what he had been and what he now was had become very difficult to close. He was no longer fighting. He was not failing in his duties. The administrative work was being done. The recruitment was proceeding. The training was rigorous and effective. He was doing exactly what he had been asked to do, and doing it well, and the well-doing of it required almost nothing of what made Luther who he was. His gift was not administration. His gift was leading men into battle and bringing them out the other side transformed by the experience into something better than they had entered it as. That gift was not being used. That gift was waiting on Caliban, in a role that anyone of reasonable intelligence and organizational ability could have filled. He had time on Caliban to think. This turned out to be among the most dangerous things that could have happened to him, and to the First Legion and to the galaxy. A man of Luther's intelligence, given extended periods without sufficient occupation for his capabilities, and with a wound in his pride that he was not entirely willing to acknowledge as a wound, and with access to the libraries and archives of the order that had been his life before the Emperor came, is a man who will find something to think about. And what Luther found to think about in the years of his Calibanite administration was the question of whether the Emperor was what the Emperor claimed to be. This question seems, on the surface, like an obvious one to ask. The Emperor was a being of extraordinary power and ancient age who had come to unify the human species and had been doing so with considerable effectiveness. But the question that Luther was really asking was not about the Emperor's capabilities or even his methods. The question was about the nature of the relationship between the Emperor and his sons, and specifically about whether that relationship was what it had always been presented as being, or whether it was something else, something that looked like love and trust and partnership from the outside, but that was at its core a more transactional arrangement than anyone had been willing to say directly. The Lion had sent him home. Whatever the reasons, the Lion had found it easier to remove Luther from his presence than to deal, directly and honestly, with whatever the problem actually was. This is the conclusion that Luther's mind kept returning to, not because it was necessarily the correct reading of what had happened, but because it was the reading that the Lion's characteristic opacity made difficult. You cannot argue against the interpretation that you've been used and set aside if the person who set you aside is constitutionally incapable of explaining their actual reasoning. You fill the silence with your own interpretation, and your own interpretation, however fair you try to make it, is inevitably colored by your own feelings. Luther's feelings. This is the simple truth beneath all of the later complexity. He had given everything to the Lion. He had recognized the extraordinary child in the forest before anyone else, and made the choice to bring him in and educate him. He had given up his own leadership, freely and without resentment, when the Lion surpassed him, because the giving up was the right. He had fought beside the Lion through the early crusade, and found the role of trusted second genuinely fulfilling, because the partnership was real. And now he was on Caliban, doing administrative work that he had not been asked whether he wanted to do, and the Lion was elsewhere, and the galaxy was being reshaped by people who had not grown up hunting great beasts in a dark forest with Luther's order for company. He did not turn to chaos immediately. This is crucial to understand. Luther's fall was not the fall of a man who stumbled into darkness. It was the fall of a man who walked toward it in stages, each stage rationalized, each step seeming smaller than the distance it actually covered. The Chaos Gods did not announce themselves to Luther as the Chaos Gods. They do not, as a rule, announce themselves at all. What came to Luther came in the form of questions that seemed reasonable. What came to Luther came in the form of knowledge that seemed interesting. What came to Luther came through the libraries of the Order, where texts had been accumulating for centuries, some of them carrying, in their margins and their subtext, and the specific way their authors had framed certain questions. The fingerprints of something that had been present on Caliban long before the Lion cleared the great beasts from the forest. long before the Emperor came. The corruption of Caliban did not begin with Luther. It began with the great beasts. The warp taint that had infected the forest's ecology had also, over the centuries of old night isolation, infected the scholarship of the orders in subtle and patient ways. The libraries of Caliban contained, mixed in with legitimate scholarship and genuine wisdom, a slow accumulation of ideas that pointed in directions the Imperial truth would have recognized as heretical if anyone had been paying close enough attention. Nobody had been paying close enough attention. The lion had cleared the physical forest of its contamination, but had not had the time, or perhaps the interest, to clear the intellectual tradition of its contamination. He had taken the warrior monks and made them space marines, and left the libraries for later. Later arrived in the form of Luther, who had both the time and the intelligence to read deeply, and who had, by the time the whispers began, developed a specific emotional wound that made him receptive to arguments he might otherwise have dismissed. The whispers did not tell Luther to betray the Emperor. The whispers told Luther that the Emperor's vision of what humanity could be was perhaps less generous to humans like Luther than it appeared. The whispers told Luther that the lion's cold brilliance, which had always been framed as a strength, was also a form of arrogance. The arrogance of a being who had decided he knew what was best for everyone around him, without troubling to ask them. The whispers told Luther that there were older and more truthful accounts of the universe's nature than the Imperial truth provided, and that a man of his intelligence deserved to know what those accounts contained. These were not outright lies. They were the Chaos Power's usual gift, which is to find the things that are partially true and present them in ways that make the partial truth feel more important than the complete picture. The Emperor's vision was not fully generous to everyone. The lion's arrogance was real. There were older accounts of the universe that the Imperial truth suppressed. Each of these things could be demonstrated. What the whispers did not provide, and what Luther in his wounded state did not fully demand, was the context that would have revealed what these partial truths were in service of. By the time the Horus heresy began, Luther had been on Caliban for years. He had not received the same news that the lion had received in the field. The heresy's early events were distant from Caliban's experience, reported in fragments and delays and through the uncertain communications of a galaxy at war with itself. When Luther and his garrison heard that Horus had turned against the Emperor, they did not have the context that would have allowed them to evaluate the news correctly. They had their own context, which was years of isolation and whisper, and the accumulated resentments of men who had felt themselves sidelined. And in that context, the question of whether the Emperor deserved the loyalty that Luther was nominally bound to maintain looked different than it had looked on the Crusade. Not all of the Dark Angels on Caliban fell with Luther. This is important and is sometimes lost in the broad telling of the story. The corruption on Caliban was real and it reached deeply into the warriors stationed there, but it was not total. There were those among the Calibanite Dark Angels who held to their oaths, who maintained their loyalty to the Emperor and to the Lion, who looked at what Luther was becoming and what the whispers were building and said clearly and simply no. These warriors became the targets of those who fell. The internal conflicts on Caliban during the heresy period were not simple or clean. They were the conflicts of a garrison fractured by ideology in conditions that did not allow for easy resolution, under circumstances of communication blackout that made it impossible to appeal to higher authority for guidance. The Lion, meanwhile, was fighting the heresy with the rest of the loyalist forces. He fought it in his characteristic way, which is to say brilliantly, and with a certain opacity that his brother Primarchs found maddening even in the crisis of open galactic civil war. He fought the Night Lords through the Thramas Crusade, in a years-long campaign against Conrad Curzay that was as much a philosophical dialogue as a military operation. Each engagement between them containing an argument about the nature of what they were each doing and why. He was part of the coalition that formed Imperium Secundus under Guilliman, served uneasily in a role that required the kind of political navigation that was not his strongest capability. He fought and won, and maintained his own counsel about what he was fighting for and why. And the warriors around him understood the value of what he was doing, while not always understanding why he was doing it in quite the way he chose. The siege of Terra ended. Horus died. The Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne. The traitor legions were pursued into the Eye of Terror. The Great Scouring did its grim work. And then the Lion turned his fleet toward home, toward Caliban, toward Luther. What he expected, if he expected anything beyond what the intelligence had told him, the intelligence that Caliban's communication had grown sparse and strange over the years of the heresy, is a matter of debate. Whether the Lion had received reports that suggested something was wrong on his homeworld, and if he had received such reports, whether he had believed them or had told himself there were explanations he would discover on arrival, whether he knew at some level that what he was returning to was not the Caliban he had left, whether the silence from home had told him something he was not yet ready to receive. The Dark Angel's fleet approached Caliban and broadcast the greetings that were appropriate for a legion returning to its home after years at war. The response was not greetings. The response was a broadside. The batteries of Caliban's surface defenses opened fire on the fleet of their own legion. The weapons that the First Legion had installed on their home world to protect it from the galaxy's enemies turned on the galaxy's first defenders. The men on those weapons were Dark Angels, or had been once. They were warriors who carried the same gene seed as the warriors in the fleet above them. They were brothers, in the technical and the practical and the emotional sense of a term that the Space Marine traditions had always insisted was sacred beyond other meanings of the word. And they were shooting at their brothers. The Lion's response was exactly what you would expect from a being of his capability and character. He directed a return fire. He organized his fleet for counteraction. He began the methodical, precise work of reducing the planetary defenses that were being used against him. And underneath the methodical precision, if anyone close enough to him could have perceived it, there was something that the Lion had very rarely shown in his career. Something that the cold clarity of his strategic mind normally prevented from reaching his exterior. He was devastated. Not dramatically, not in the way of beings who express their devastation openly. In the quiet, internal, unreachable way of someone who has built a great deal on a foundation they believed was solid, and has just been informed that the foundation was not what they thought it. The battle for Caliban was one-sided in the military sense. The First Legion, honed by years of the heresy's most desperate fighting, was not going to lose a campaign against a planetary garrison led by a former Second who had, however excellent his capabilities, not been fighting at that level for years. The orbital bombardment was systematic. The surface defenses were reduced. The landings were made. Luther's forces fought, and fought with the ferocity of beings who understood that there was no outcome from this confrontation that looked like survival in any conventional sense, but fought because fighting was the only remaining expression of what they had chosen. And then, at some point in the fighting, the Lion and Luther met. There are no reliable witnesses to what happened in the chamber where they fought. There are accounts, fragmentary and contradictory, some of them clearly mythologized in the centuries of retelling, some of them possibly genuine fragments of testimony from warriors who were nearby. What the accounts agree on is the broad outline. They fought. The duel between them, which was a duel between the greatest Primarch in the galaxy at the height of his powers and the man who had made him possible, lasted long enough that both of them were wounded. Luther, whose enhancements and the dark gifts he had received in the years of his corruption gave him a capability that went considerably beyond what any ordinary space marine could sustain, wounded the Lion grievously. Mortally in the ordinary sense of that word, though Primarchs do not die by ordinary rules. And then something happened to Luther. The accounts disagree about what it was. Some say he understood what he had done in the moment of doing it. Some say the warp powers that had been sustaining him withdrew suddenly, either because his usefulness to them was ended, or because the proximity of the Lion's dying presence triggered something in Luther that the powers could not maintain against. Some say he simply broke, the accumulated weight of what he had become, and what he had done pressing through the last walls of rationalization in a single catastrophic moment of clarity. What all the accounts agree on is that Luther, standing over the body of the being he had once loved as a son, collapsed into something that was not quite madness, but was indistinguishable from it. To outside observers, he could not be reached. He was present, but absent. He spoke, but what he spoke was not coherent. He was imprisoned in the deepest place that could be found in the wreckage of what had once been his world, which was now becoming something else entirely. Because Caliban was dying. The precise mechanism varies between accounts, as the precise mechanism of anything that involves the warp varies between accounts. But the consistent understanding is that the battle had accumulated enough psychic violence and warp energy, and the corruption that had seeped into Caliban's deep roots over centuries of old night isolation had been stirred by the confrontation. And the wounded Lion's disappearance triggered something in the local warp conditions that the remains of the planet could not contain. A storm came. A storm of the kind that the warp produces when the conditions are exactly wrong in exactly the right way. A storm that tore at real space with the force of a broken dream. Caliban shattered. The ancient forests, already burned and scarred by the orbital bombardment, came apart in the storm's devastation. The world that had produced both the Lion and Luther, that had spent 10 millennia developing a warrior culture capable of fighting things that came from the dark, that had been the homeworld of the First Legion and the source of its particular strengths and its particular secrets, was destroyed. The forest that had never been simply a forest, the libraries that had contained both the wisdom of generations and the slow corruption that had worked on Luther's mind, were gone. The great beasts were gone. Long since, killed by the Lion in the years before the Emperor came. Everything else was gone with them. What was not gone was the fallen angels. That is what they are called. In the interior discourse of the Dark Angels and their successor chapters, those warriors who stood with Luther on Caliban and fought against their own legion when the fleet returned. They had turned. Some of them had turned deeply, their corruption genuine and chaos marked in ways that were unmistakable. Some of them had turned in ways that were more complicated, following Luther out of loyalty rather than belief, or following because the divisions on Caliban had been presented to them in terms that made the choice less clear than it looks from the outside. Some of them, in the fragmentary accounts that have been preserved, had reservations that they expressed too late or not at all, and found themselves on the wrong side of a line that had been drawn while they were not paying attention. The warp storm that destroyed Caliban did not kill them. This is the feature of the story that makes what followed possible, and what followed is still continuing. The warp storm scattered them, across space, across time, through the unpredictable currents of the Imperium that do not respect the linear progression of events that mortal minds depend on to organize experience. The fallen were distributed through the galaxy in ways that the galaxy cannot fully account for, placed in eras and locations that were not the era and location of Caliban's destruction. Some of them emerged from the storm in the centuries immediately following the fall. Some emerged in later millennia. Some, the Dark Angels have reason to believe, have not yet emerged at all. The warp carries them still in its cold and ancient currents, waiting for the moment when they will arrive in real space and become once again the Dark Angels' most urgent problem. The lion was not dead. This is the other thing that the storm's devastation did not accomplish. The lion lay dying in the wreckage of his world, his wounds mortal by every standard available. And then the Watchers in the Dark came for him. The Watchers in the Dark are among the most genuinely strange elements of the Dark Angels' history, which is a remarkable distinction given the competition. They are small. They wear hooded robes. They are present in the records of the Dark Angels that predate the lion's departure in certain ceremonies and certain places, always peripheral, always just at the edge of what was happening, never directly involved in anything, but also never entirely absent. Their nature is not known, at least not publicly. The Watchers in the Dark took the lion from the battlefield. They took him somewhere inside the rock, which is what remained of Caliban after the storm, the largest surviving fragment of the destroyed world, now the mobile fortress monastery of the Dark Angels, drifting through the void as both the chapter's base of operations and the physical remnant of the world that made them. The lion was placed in a chamber in the deepest part of the rock, and the Watchers in the Dark tended him, and there he lay for 10,000 years, not dead, healing, waiting, in a sleep that was also something more than sleep, for the moment when the galaxy would require him again. The Dark Angels did not know, for a long time, that he was there. Or more precisely, some of them suspected and others did not know, and the knowledge was held close by those who had it. Because the knowledge of the lion's location was the most sensitive intelligence the First Legion possessed, more sensitive in some ways than the secret of the fallen. The lion asleep was a hope. The secret of the fallen was a wound, and they had to decide what to do with that wound. The decision to keep the secret was not made in a single moment. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it, because a secret that was decided in a single moment might have been decided differently in a different moment. And the consequences of a different decision are interesting to contemplate, even if they are not recoverable. The secret grew. It developed from the immediate, practical urgency of surviving the aftermath of the heresy, without having to answer the questions that the Inquisition would ask if they knew everything. And it hardened over decades and centuries into something that had moved beyond practical necessity, into something more like identity. The Dark Angels kept their secret not just because they kept their secret because keeping it was, by the time most of their warriors joined the chapter, simply what the Dark Angels did. The practical necessity in the immediate aftermath was real. The Horus heresy had ended with the Emperor on the Golden Throne and the Imperium in the kind of condition that makes governance maximally difficult. The new institutions that were coalescing around the attempt to maintain what the Crusade had built were looking at every legion and every record with eyes that had just watched the most trusted warriors in history betray everything. The Inquisition was not yet fully formed, but its predecessors were active, and they were not inclined toward charity. The questions that would be asked of the Dark Angels, if the full truth of Caliban were known, were questions to which there were no good answers. What happened on Caliban? A significant portion of the 1st Legion garrison turned against their own brothers and fired on the returning fleet. What made them turn? Years of corruption, fed by warp-touched texts from a compromised library, cultivated by a specific resentment in their commander. What is the current status of those traitors? They are scattered through space and time by a warp storm, and the Dark Angels do not fully know where they are. Are any of them still active? Yes, are any of them currently serving chaos? Some of them certainly were, and the current disposition of the rest is not fully known. What is the Dark Angels' plan for dealing with this threat? These questions, answered honestly, would have produced an investigation that the newly formed Dark Angels chapter would not have controlled, and an investigation that would have revealed things about the internal culture of the 1st Legion that the warriors who remained had very good reasons to prefer not examined too closely. The corruption on Caliban had not only touched the fallen. The ideas that Luther had engaged with, the doubts that had circulated through the Calibanite garrison during the years of the heresy, had touched warriors who ultimately chose the right side, but who had not always been certain which side was right. There are shades of grey in the interior history of the 1st Legion that the Dark Angels did not and do not want illuminated by outside examination. So the decision was made. The survivors would say nothing. Not nothing in the sense of an active denial, at least not initially. Nothing in the sense of a careful omission, a version of the truth that was technically accurate and also strategically incomplete. Caliban had been destroyed in the heresy. The homeworld was gone. Losses had been severe. The chapter would reconstitute itself and serve the Imperium faithfully going forward. None of these statements were false. None of them provided anyone with the information that would have made them ask the follow-up questions. The problem was the fallen themselves. The fallen who had survived the storm and emerged in real space were still out there. Some of them were actively doing damage. Warbands of Dark Angels who had fully committed to chaos, fighting against the Imperium with all the capability that their genocide and their training had given them. Some of them were doing less damage, living quietly in the galaxy's margins, trying not to be noticed, not actively serving chaos, but not actively repudiating it either. Some of them were, in the fragmentary accounts the Dark Angels would gather over time, struggling with what they had been and what they had become, still carrying the conviction that had led them to Luther without entirely believing in it anymore. And all of them carried, in their living bodies and their surviving memories, the capability to speak about what had happened on Caliban in ways that the Dark Angels could not control. If the Inquisition found a fallen angel before the Dark Angels did, the conversation that would follow was one that the Dark Angels could not allow to happen. Not because of anything as simple as fear, because of what the conversation would contain. The fallen carried the story of Caliban in first-person testimony. They carried the story of Luther's corruption and the division within the garrison and the specific events of the bombardment and the battle. They carried potentially information about what the Lion had done in the years before Caliban. Information that the Dark Angel's inner circles considered sensitive in ways that extended beyond the fallen specifically. A fallen angel talking freely to the Inquisition was not just a threat to the Dark Angel's reputation. It was a threat to the entire architecture of carefully maintained incomplete information that the chapter had built its post-heresy existence on. The hunt became the defining feature of what the Dark Angels were, in ways that gradually replaced what they had been before. What they had been before was a legion of extraordinary warriors, whose most distinctive feature was their strategic intelligence and their mastery of information control. What they became was a chapter whose most distinctive feature was an obsession with the recovery and interrogation and silencing of the fallen. The shift was not abrupt, it was gradual, and it was driven by genuine operational necessity, and it was also, by the time it had fully taken hold, something considerably more than operational necessity. The chapter reorganized itself around the hunt, without ever announcing that it was doing so. The Deathwing, the Dark Angel's elite first company, nominally the pinnacle of the chapter's warrior class, accessible to those who had demonstrated the highest levels of capability and dedication. In reality, the Deathwing was also the cadre of warriors who were trusted with the full truth of the chapter's history. When a warrior was inducted into the Deathwing, he was brought before the Inner Circle, the secretive hierarchy that maintained the knowledge of what had actually happened on Caliban. And he was told, not everything, because not even the Inner Circle possessed everything, but enough. Enough to understand why the chapter fought the way it fought, why it prioritized certain missions over others, why it sometimes appeared to Imperial commanders on the battlefield as a legion that had been called away from a planetary defense by something that mattered more than the planetary defense. The Raven Wing, the Dark Angel's second company, nominally the chapter's fast attack specialists, mounted warriors and aerial cavalry who could range far ahead of the main body of the chapter to scout and strike. In reality, the Raven Wing's primary function was to locate the fallen. They were the hunters, the trackers, the warriors who moved through the galaxy following the cold trails that fallen angels left behind them, identifying sightings and building the intelligence pictures that would eventually allow the Deathwing to close and make the actual capture. A warrior in the Raven Wing did not necessarily know the full truth of what they were hunting. They knew there were enemies of the chapter who needed to be found. The specifics, the how and the who and the why, were part of the higher mysteries that would be revealed if they proved themselves worthy of the Deathwing's initiation. The Inner Circle sat at the apex of this structure, a hierarchy of knowledge that was also a hierarchy of rank, in which the highest positions required the most complete understanding of the chapter's shame. The Supreme Grand Master, the Dark Angel's most senior figure, bore the most complete version of the truth that any living member of the chapter possessed. Below him, in descending grades of seniority and corresponding grades of disclosure, the Inner Circle carried the architecture of the secret, each level knowing slightly more than the level below, each level tasked with the guidance and oversight of those with less complete information. It was, in its structure, a kind of church, a secretive religious order organized around the custodianship of a truth that only certain initiates were trusted to hold. The Dark Angels had become, without entirely meaning to, a fraternal order devoted to the maintenance of their own shame. What happened to a fallen angel who was caught? Two outcomes were possible, and the Dark Angels preferred one of them over the other with a passion that had theological weight to it. The preferred outcome was redemption. Not redemption in the sense that the fallen who repented was allowed to walk free and return to the Imperium service. Not redemption in any practical or social sense. Redemption in a specifically Dark Angels sense, which meant that the fallen angel, through the process of interrogation conducted by the chapter's interrogator chaplains, arrived at a genuine acknowledgement of what he had done and why it was wrong. The interrogator chaplains were among the most skilled practitioners of psychological pressure in the Imperium, and their skill was not deployed brutally, at least not primarily. It was deployed with a patience and a sophistication that reflected the same understanding of information and its extraction that the First Legion had always possessed. They were not simply torturers, though some accounts suggest that what they did could shade toward that depending on circumstances. They were seekers of a specific thing, which was the genuine acknowledgement of the moment when the fallen angel, looking at what he had been and what he had done and what it had cost, said, "Yes, I was wrong. I understand why I was wrong. I accept the weight of that." What happened after redemption? Death. Usually the redeemed fallen died, in conditions that were as humane as the chapter's theology permitted, and were recorded in the Dark Angels' internal annals as having made their account with their Primarch. There is a ceremony, kept carefully secret from anyone outside the inner circle, that marks the death of a redeemed fallen. It involves the lion in some way, or the symbol of the lion, or perhaps the actual presence of the lion in some form that the Watchers in the Dark make possible. The precise nature of this ceremony is among the most closely guarded information in the chapter's possession. The other outcome was death without redemption. A fallen who refused to repent, who maintained their defiance of the lion and their commitment to whatever they had committed to on Caliban, was also killed. The difference in the Dark Angels' theology was everything. A fallen who died in defiance died as a traitor, their shame unresolved. Their place in whatever afterlife the chapter's complicated relationship with Imperial theology allowed for denied to them. A fallen who died in repentance died as something more like a soldier who had made a terrible error and acknowledged it. The Dark Angels cared about this distinction with an intensity that someone outside their tradition might find puzzling, but which makes complete sense once you understand that the entire structure of the chapter's psychology is built around the question of guilt and its resolution. The interrogator chaplains were artists of this process. They studied the fallen before engaging with them, when possible. They understood the psychology of their specific quarry, the history that had brought them to wherever they had been found, the specific shape of the self that they had built after Caliban. They entered the interrogation room knowing things that the fallen often did not know they knew, and they used that knowledge the way a skilled carpenter uses good tools, with precision and purpose and the patience of someone who is doing work that matters too much to rush. The sessions could last years. The Dark Angels had the patience for years. They were a chapter that had been waiting for 10,000 years for the last fallen to be recovered and the accounting to be complete. They could wait for individual repentance. Not all of the fallen who were captured reached the interrogation room. Some died in the recovery operation. Some were killed resisting capture. This was acceptable in the Dark Angel's theological framework in a regrettable way. A fallen who could not be taken alive had to be killed, and a fallen who had not repented was a traitor who died as a traitor, and this was worse than the alternative but was at least a resolution of a kind. What the Dark Angels could not accept was a fallen in the hands of anyone else. The Inquisition, a friendly chapter, an Imperial authority, anyone other than the Dark Angels. Any of these alternatives were worse than a dead fallen, because a living fallen in someone else's hands was a fallen who was talking, and the Dark Angels could not control what that fallen said or to whom. The lengths to which the Dark Angels have gone to prevent this outcome are, in the fragmentary accounts that have survived in various inquisitorial records, genuinely alarming. There are documented instances of Dark Angels withdrawing from planetary defense operations mid-battle, because intelligence indicated a fallen angel was present elsewhere. There are instances of the chapter interfering with inquisitorial operations to recover individuals that the Inquisition did not realize were Dark Angels' concerns. There are instances of actions taken against people who possessed too much information about the fallen. Actions whose precise nature is recorded in code that has never been fully deciphered. The Dark Angels have never made a clean break between their duty to the Imperium and their duty to the secret. When the two have conflicted, their response has been, on some occasions, to choose the secret. This is the charge that the Inquisitors who know enough to formulate it hold against the First Legion. Not that the Dark Angels are traitors, because they manifestly are not. Not that their warriors are less than fully capable of the service they provide, because that capability is indisputable. The charge is that the Dark Angels are an organization that has decided its own institutional interests sometimes outweigh the interests of the people they are supposed to serve. That the secret they carry has distorted their loyalties in ways they do not fully acknowledge, even to that they are, in the specific and technical sense of the term, not entirely trustworthy. Because an organization that keeps secrets of this magnitude from its brothers keeps them for reasons of self-preservation that are not the same as the reasons of the Imperium's preservation. And then there is Cypher. Among all the fallen, there is one who is different from the others in ways that the Dark Angel's theology has never adequately processed. A figure who has been cited on hundreds of worlds across 10,000 years, in contexts ranging from direct combat to mysterious appearances at moments of galactic scale significance. A figure who carries two weapons, a bolt pistol and a plasma pistol, and who fights with them with a precision that suggests a warrior of exceptional capability, who has been fighting for a very long time, and has had a great deal of practice. A figure who also carries in a scabbard at his side a sword, a very specific sword, the sword of the lion. Or perhaps not. The accounts disagree about the precise identity of the blade, as they disagree about almost everything involving this figure. But the most consistent version of the story, the one that appears in the largest number of independent accounts, is that the figure called Cypher carries the blade that once belonged to Lionel Johnson, Primarch of the First Legion, and has carried it for 10,000 years, and has never drawn it. The name is itself a statement. Cipher, a code. Something that encodes meaning, that contains meaning while concealing it, that requires a key to interpret. The Dark Angels who have encountered Cypher have found him impossible to simply categorize as either the enemy they expect him to be or as something else. He has fought against the Dark Angels. He has also, in documented instances, fought beside them, appearing at moments when a crisis required someone of exceptional capability and fighting on the side that preserved rather than destroyed. He has been captured by the Dark Angels on at least one occasion. He escaped. He has been present at events of galactic significance. The siege of the Fenris system, the attack on Macragge during the Plague Wars, appearances in the corridors of the Rock itself, the Dark Angels' fortress monastery. He moves through the galaxy with a freedom that no one of his alleged heritage should possess, appearing where he appears without evident purpose, doing what he does without evident allegiance, carrying the sword that he has never drawn. What does Cypher want? The Dark Angel's official position is that he is a fallen angel who must be recovered and subjected to the same process as all other fallen. The difficulty with this position is that the evidence of Cypher's actual behavior does not align cleanly with the category of a corrupted warrior serving the ruinous powers. There are theories. There are always theories about the theory that he seeks terror, that he has been moving toward the Emperor for 10,000 years, with the intention of presenting the sword to its owner and receiving some form of judgment or absolution that only the Emperor could provide. The theory that he is the most sophisticated agent of a chaos power yet encountered, a being so deeply embedded in a long game that his apparent contradictions are cover for a purpose that has not yet been revealed. The theory that he is neither of these things, that Cypher is genuinely something the Dark Angel's theology has not made, a being who has been carrying a burden for 10,000 years without being certain of the right way to set it down. The sword matters because of what the sword represents. The lion carried it. The lion is sleeping in the rock, healing from the wound that Luther gave him, tended by the watchers in the dark, in the deepest chamber of the world that destroyed itself around the Primarch who made it. The lion's sword is not in the rock with him. It is in the galaxy, being carried by a figure who is by the Dark Angel's definition a traitor but who does not quite behave like one. The gap between these facts is the space in which Cypher exists, and it is a space that has been accumulating meaning for a very long time. The unforgiven. That is what the Dark Angels and their successor chapters call themselves, in the private language of their inner circles. Not the purified. The unforgiven. Because the debt is not yet paid. Because the accounting is not complete, because there are still fallen angels in the galaxy who have not been recovered and have not repented, and until the last of them is recovered and the last repentance is given or the last defiance is ended, the chapter carries the name of those who have not been forgiven, because they have not yet asked for forgiveness. The successor chapters share the secret. When the second founding divided the legions into chapters, the first legion's successors, the angels of absolution, the angels of redemption, the angels of vengeance, the disciples of Caliban and the others, were inducted into the truth. Not by external authority, by the surviving members of the First Legion themselves, who recognized that the secret was too large and too fragile to maintain if only one chapter knew it, but who also recognized that sharing it required the same commitment to keeping it that they had been maintaining since the day after Caliban's destruction. The successor chapters became the unforgiven. They became participants in the hunt, maintaining their own networks of intelligence about the fallen, and contributing their own warriors to recovery operations when the intelligence pointed to a specific location. This creates, in the current age, a situation that the Inquisition finds profoundly uncomfortable whenever it examines it closely enough to recognize what it is looking at. There are multiple Space Marine chapters that share a secret too large to be controlled, too dangerous to be released, and too old to be fully resolved. Chapters that will, when their duty to the secret requires it, coordinate across normal chapter boundaries in ways that the Codex Astartes does not explicitly authorize. Chapters that have a shared loyalty to an agenda that is not the Imperium's agenda, even though it runs parallel to the Imperium's interests in most circumstances. Chapters that are, in the most precise possible sense, a secret society within a military institution that was explicitly forbidden from having secret societies because the last time Space Marines had secret societies, it contributed to the Horus heresy. The irony of this has not been lost on those Inquisitors who have gotten close enough to the truth to appreciate it. The Dark Angels, who themselves were partly victims of the warrior lodges that Erebus seeded through the legions during the years before the heresy, have recreated in their own institution something structurally very similar to the thing that helped destroy their homeworld. The Inner Circle is not a chaos cult. The motivations of the Dark Angels' secret society are not the corrupted motivations of Erebus's lodges. But the structure is the same. A hierarchy of restricted knowledge. An inner membership that knows more than the outer membership. A set of priorities that the outer membership is not fully informed about. The form has been recreated in the service of an entirely different content. But the form itself carries risks that the Dark Angel's theology has not fully confronted. And running beneath all of this, in the deepest chamber of the rock, the lion waits. He has been there for 10,000 years. The Watchers in the dark have tended him, their nature still unclear, their purpose still only partially legible, their presence in the rock and around the lion suggesting a connection to whatever ancient intelligence existed on Caliban before the humans arrived and built their order above it. The lion heals slowly, in the way that beings of his nature heal. The wound Luther gave him closing at a pace that mortal medicine cannot explain, and that mortal time cannot easily measure. He has been present in some form for the ceremonies of the Inner Circle, whether he is aware of what happens in those ceremonies, whether he is aware of the hunt that has been conducted in his name, whether he is aware of the 10,000 years that have passed since he lay down in the rock's deepest chamber. None of this is known with what changed in the current age, the age that began when the Great Rift split the galaxy and the darkness pressed in from every direction, was that the conditions the Watchers had been waiting for finally arrived. The lion's healing, whatever process the Watchers in the dark had been supervising in their silent way for 10 millennia, reached its completion. Or perhaps the galaxy's need reached a threshold that the Watchers recognized as requiring the lion's return. The accounts in the most recent Dark Angels records are fragmentary and highly controlled, as all Dark Angels records are. But the consistent element is that Lionel Johnson is no longer sleeping in the deepest chamber of the rock. He is awake. He is healed. He is, by the accounts of those who have seen him, himself, in all the ways that the word applies to a being who disappeared 10,000 years ago and has returned to find a galaxy that has changed in almost every way except the direction in which it needs fighting. He is The lion, cold and brilliant and terrible and capable in the specific way that his gene crafting and his forest upbringing and his decades of the Great Crusade made him. He is also, and this is perhaps the most interesting element of what the scattered reports suggest, aware that there are things that need to be said. Things that were not said before Caliban. Things that, had they been said, might have changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Whether the lion has confronted the knowledge of what happened in his absence, of the hunt and the unforgiven and the decades of missions abandoned for the sake of the secret, is something the available records do not address clearly. Whether he knows about Luther, still imprisoned in the rocks deep, still alive in whatever state Luther exists in, receiving visions that the Watchers and the Inner Circle have never fully been able to explain. Whether he knows about Cypher and the sword. Whether he has been told, by whoever first reached him after his awakening, the full history of what the chapter he created has become. These are questions that the galaxy is still in the process of answering. What is certain is that his return has happened at a moment of maximum need. The Cicatrix Maledictum divides the galaxy. The Daemon Primarchs walk in real space. The Imperium fights on 1,000 fronts simultaneously with resources that were inadequate for the scope of the threat before the Great Rift, and are catastrophically inadequate now. The Emperor is still on the Golden Throne, neither living nor dead, sustaining the Astronomicon and the Astronomicon's maintenance of the basic navigational capability that allows interstellar civilization to exist, but unable to do anything more than this. The sons of the Primarchs that still remain are few. The Primarchs themselves are fewer still. Guilliman returned in the years immediately before the Great Rift. The lion has returned in the years after it. 2 of the Emperor's sons awakened in the darkness, fighting for a civilization that has become unrecognizable in its distance from the dream that made them. What the lion's return means for the Dark Angel's secret is among the most significant questions in the current Warhammer universe's political landscape, if landscape is the right word for the fractured, burning, daemon-haunted condition of the galaxy in the era Indomitus. The secret was built around the lion's absence. It was maintained in his name, justified by the idea that when the accounting was finally complete, the lion would receive the final repentances and the final defiances, and something would be resolved. Now the lion, the intermediary structure of the Inner Circle, exists between the sleeping Primarch and the reality of the fallen. And now that structure has to face the being on whose behalf it was created. He has seen enough of what his chapter has become. He has seen enough of the hunt and its costs. And if the current accounts are to be believed, his response has been something more complex than simple approval of 10,000 years of obsessive secrecy. The lion's characteristic opacity makes it difficult to know what he thinks about what he has found. But he is the lion, and the lion has always understood, at the deepest level of his strategy, the difference between a secret that serves a purpose and a secret that has become its own purpose. The first is a weapon. The second is a case. The tragedy of the Dark Angels, the thing that makes their story one of the most genuinely complex and genuinely sad in all of Warhammer 40,000, is that their secret was never simply about shame. It was always, at its root, about a relationship. The relationship between the lion and Luther. The relationship between a Primarch who could not tell the people he loved that he loved them, and the man who had been his mentor and his partner, and who had needed to hear it more than he needed anything else the galaxy could provide. Luther did not fall to chaos because he was evil. Luther fell because a wound opened in him, slowly over years of absence, and the darkness found that wound and used it with the patient precision that the darkness always brings to the wounds it finds. This is the theme that runs through every betrayal in the history of the Horus heresy. The Chaos Gods do not create the wounds, they find them. Lorgar's wound was the raising of Monarchia and the need to believe in something. Horus's wound was the Emperor's absence and the need to be loved. Angron's wound was carved into his skull by the High Riders of New Syria and was never allowed to heal, and Luther's wound was the silence of the lion, the specific and devastating silence of a being who was incapable of saying, "You matter to me, I trust you, I value what we are together," in ways that cannot be replaced by your administrative competence or your excellent service record or any of the other things I could say that are true but are not what you need to hear. The Dark Angels have been living inside this tragedy for 10,000 years. Their hunt is, in a way that they may not fully articulate even to themselves, an attempt to resolve the thing that created it. If every fallen repents, if the accounting is complete, if the debt is paid, then perhaps the original wound can be considered closed. Perhaps the thing that Luther became, and the destruction that followed, can be given a sufficient closure that the chapter can move forward without the secret weighing it down. This is the hope, held quietly in the deepest levels of the inner circle's theology, that has sustained the hunt across 10 millennia. Not the hope of vengeance, the hope of resolution. But resolution requires honesty, and honesty is not what the Dark Angels have chosen. They have chosen the hunt, and the secret, and the hierarchy of partial truths, and the carefully maintained incomplete information. They have chosen, in other words, the same approach to a painful truth that the lion himself chose when he sent Luther home instead of telling him why. They have responded to the lion's failure of honesty with a 10,000-year institutional commitment to the same failure, replicated at scale, maintained by an ever-growing hierarchy of warriors who understand pieces of the truth but none of whom possess it all. The irony is as dark as anything the Chaos Gods have produced. The First Legion, the oldest and once perhaps the greatest, defined by secrets and the keeping of them, fighting its long war not against chaos, but against the consequences of its own Primarch's inability to say 3 simple words. I trust you. That is what Luther needed, not an explanation of every tactical decision, not a detailed accounting of the reasoning behind the choice to send him home, just, I trust you. I value you. You matter to me in ways that I cannot entirely express, but that are real. The galaxy might have looked very different if those words had been spoken. The Dark Angels would certainly look very different. Caliban would still be a world rather than a graveyard of orbiting debris. The words were not spoken. The words are still not being spoken exactly. Even with the lion returned. Even with the current age offering something closer to the honesty that has always been missing. The Dark Angels move in their shadows and keep their secrets and hunt their fallen with the relentless, obsessive dedication that has defined them since the day after their homeworld died. They are extraordinary warriors. They are fully loyal to the Imperium in every sense that matters on the battlefield. They are also a chapter that has spent 10,000 years proving that you cannot resolve a wound by hiding it. That shame maintained in secret does not diminish but accumulates interest. And that the legacy of a Primarch's silence is the silence of a chapter. Cypher still moves through the galaxy with the lion's sword. Luther still sits in the deep dark of the rock, receiving his visions. The fallen still scatter through time and space in the warps, and the interrogator chaplains still work with their patient and sophisticated arts at the business of asking the question that the inner circle has been asking for 10,000 years. Do you understand what you did? And do you acknowledge that it was wrong? The question has never been fully answered. The accounting has never been completed, and somewhere in the rock the lion, who has returned after 10 millennia of healing sleep, is perhaps beginning to understand that the accounting will never be completed the way the chapter has been trying to complete it. Because the question the interrogator chaplains have been asking is the wrong question. The question they should be asking is not the one about the fallen. The question they should be asking is the one about the lion, about what he failed to give to the man he loved, and what that failure cost the galaxy, and whether the silence that created the catastrophe can finally, after 10,000 years, be broken. There are moments in the current age when it seems possible that it might be. When the lion, returned from his long sleep, looks at the structure of secrets and partial truths that his chapter has built in his name and shows something in his expression that was not there before he slept. A recognition, perhaps, an understanding that what was built in service of managing the consequences of what happened on Caliban cannot simply be maintained indefinitely. That secrecy, as a response to shame, is not stable. That the dark angels have been holding a wound closed with their hands for 10,000 years, and their hands are getting tired, and at some point the wound will need to be cleaned rather than simply contained. This is the hope that the Dark Angel's story offers, in the darkness of the age it occupies. Not the hope of victory in the conventional military sense, not the hope that the hunt will be completed, and the fallen will all repent and the secret will somehow cease to matter. The hope that a Primarch who could not say 3 words 10,000 years ago might eventually find a way to say them now. That the First Legion, the oldest and most burdened, the chapter that has been carrying its shame through every age of the Imperium, might be approaching the moment when it can lay it down. Not because the shame was not real, not because what happened on Caliban was anything other than devastating, but because shame maintained in silence for 10,000 years is not penance. It is a different kind of wound, self-inflicted, and it has been doing its own damage alongside the damage done by the fallen themselves. The galaxy is dark. The Cicatrix Maledictum bleeds across the stars. The Daemon Primarchs are awake and moving. The enemies of humanity press in from every direction. And the Dark Angels, the First Legion, the oldest of the Emperor's warriors, fight on in their shadows, keeping their secrets, hunting their fallen, carrying their burden across the burning length of a galaxy that needs every loyal warrior it can find. They are extraordinary. They are indispensable. They are, in every sense that the Imperium has ever used to evaluate its defenders, worthy, and they are still not telling the whole truth. That is the dark secret of the Dark Angels. Not just what happened on Caliban, though that is dark enough. Not just the existence of the fallen, though that is dangerous enough. The dark secret is that the oldest and most storied chapter in the service of the Emperor is a chapter that has decided its own history is too shameful to be honestly accounted for, and that this decision, made in the aftermath of a tragedy that was itself born from a failure of honest communication, has been reproduced in the chapter's institutional culture in ways that the Lion's return has not yet fully confronted. The dark secret is that the First Legion is still, 10,000 years later, doing what the Lion did when he sent Luther home, instead of telling him the truth. They are acting rather than communicating. They are demonstrating rather than saying. They are keeping secrets rather than speaking the words that might, at whatever cost, begin to close. The fire in the rock burns low, tended by the watchers in the dark in their inexplicable way. The sword waits still undrawn, still carried by the figure who has been carrying it for longer than most civilizations have existed. The Lion is awake. The hunt continues. The debt is unpaid. And the dark angels, the unforgiven, march into the darkness of a galaxy that has never needed them more, carrying the weight of 10,000 years of silence, fighting for a humanity that does not know what they carry, keeping the secret that has become inseparable from who they are. That is their tragedy, and it is real, and it matters. Because the weapon that broke them was not a sword or a gene curse or a daemon's gift. The weapon that broke them was the one that breaks most things when it is absent in a place where it is needed. The weapon was a word, trust, and the word was not spoken. And the galaxy has been paying for that silence in ways that are still accumulating their interest, still compounding their debt. Still waiting, like Luther in the dark beneath the rock, for the moment when someone finds a way to say what should have been said. The work of remembrance is as sacred as the battles we fight. And the first step of that work for the Dark Angels is the step they have been most reluctant to take. They remember, with the obsessive precision that 10,000 years of the Inner Circle's custodianship has maintained. But to tell, to let the weight of what they know be shared, examined, considered by more than the carefully controlled hierarchy of those who have been deemed worthy of the truth, to trust that what they are, and what they have done in 10,000 years of law is sufficient to survive the honest accounting of what they were. Whether they will take that step, whether the Lion's return has brought them closer to it, or whether the institutional momentum of 10,000 years of secrecy is too great to be easily redirected even by the Primarch himself, is a story that the current age of the Imperium is still in the process of telling. The Dark Angels move in their shadows. The hunt goes on. The fallen scatter through time and space and wait for the moment they will be found. And somewhere in the galaxy a figure in dark armor moves through the dark between stars, carrying a sword that belongs to a sleeping king who no longer sleeps, never drawing it, never setting it down, walking toward a destination that 10,000 years of movement have not yet reached. The blade is still in the scabbard. The question is still unanswered. The Dark Angels are still the unforgiven. For now, to understand why the silence mattered so much, you need to understand what the Lion was. Not what he did. Not the campaigns and the victories and the strategic masterstrokes that made him the most respected military mind among all the Primarchs. What he was. Because the most difficult and the most human truth about Lionel Johnson is that he was, in the most fundamental, a person who did not know how to be known. He was extraordinary. He was brilliant. He was loyal with an absoluteness that the Horus Heresy would eventually prove went all the way to the foundation of whatever he was. He was also a person who had emerged from years of solitary survival in a forest that wanted to kill him. Been found by warriors who saw in him something extraordinary before they had the language to name it, and then spent his entire life at the apex of every hierarchy he inhabited. He was always already, by the time anyone might have helped him, the most capable person. You do not learn to be vulnerable when you are always the most capable person in the room. the opportunity never presents itself. The vulnerability that might have been developed in ordinary childhood, the experience of needing help, of being confused, of being less than the task, was not available to the lion. He had been beyond that, almost since conscious. What emerged from this formation was a man who knew how to trust through demonstration rather than declaration, who showed his faith in a person by giving them important responsibilities rather than by saying, "I trust you," who expressed his regard for someone by maintaining their place in his confidence rather than by saying, "You matter to me." To the lion, these expressions, the action and the statement, were the same thing. He did not understand, or did not fully understand, that the people around him, the people he actually depended on and valued, did not necessarily read the actions the way he intended them. That Luther, sent home to manage Caliban, might read that action not as the confident delegation of critical responsibility to the person he trusted most, but as the gap between what the lion meant and what Luther understood is the wound that the chaos powers found. Not a manufactured wound. Not a vulnerability that chaos created. A natural, human, entirely understandable gap in communication between two beings who were extraordinarily capable at almost everything except telling each other what they felt. And in that gap, given years to develop in Luther's absence from the front, given the whispers and the old texts and the slow accumulation of doubt, what had been a close bond became something that could not hold the weight it was being asked to bear. Consider Luther on Caliban in those years. Consider what it meant to have been who he was and to have ended up where he had been, the master of the order, the greatest warrior on a world that produced warriors as its primary cultural output. He had discovered the extraordinary child in the forest and made a choice that changed the history of the galaxy. He had given that child everything that was his to give. Not grudgingly, not with a hidden ledger of debts, genuinely, because generosity of that scale was part of who Luther was. He had given up his own primacy freely, without resentment. Because the right thing to do when you recognize something greater than yourself is to make room for it. He had been the lion's second through years of war and achievement, and the great project of the crusade. He had been essential. And now he was on Caliban, essential to Caliban's administration in a way that he would have found insulting if anyone had pointed it out, because Caliban's administration did not require him. It required someone organized and capable and trustworthy, and those qualities in Luther were real, but they were the least interesting things about him. He was like a master surgeon being asked to sort medical records. The work needed doing. He was capable of doing it. The work was simply not worth what it cost. The warriors around him on Caliban were feeling variations of the same thing. The Calibanite Dark Angels who had been left with Luther were men who had fought through campaigns of the Great Crusade and been returned to their homeworld for reasons that were not fully explained. Some of them had been injured as Luther had. Some of them had been deemed unsuitable for the ongoing campaigns for reasons that varied and were not always clear to those deemed unsuitable. Some of them had been returned because the administrative load genuinely required warriors of their quality. The reasons varied. The experience of being returned when the war continued without you is consistent in its emotional content regardless of the stated reason. In groups, over years, with the whispers available and the old texts available and each other to talk to. In the absence of the lion, who would have cut through any developing doubt with the simple authority of his presence. In the absence of decisive clarity about what was happening with Horus and whether the heresy was real and what the right response to it was. In all of this absence, the Calibanite garrison became something that was still nominally the First Legion, but was, in the specific ways that matter most, becoming something else. It is worth noting that the heresy's influence on Caliban did not look, from the inside, like chaos corruption. It looked like doubt. It looked like the reasonable question of whether the Emperor's project had been everything it promised. It looked like the conversation that people have when the system they have been serving appears to contain fundamental problems that the system's official discourse does not acknowledge. These are not in themselves chaos. They are the kind of doubt that a healthy institution can accommodate, if it has mechanisms for honest examination and correction. The First Legion on Caliban did not have those. The lion was the mechanism. The lion's cold clarity, which his warriors found sometimes alienating and always reliable, was the thing that cut through ambiguity and provided the frame within which doubt could be evaluated and either resolved or set aside. Without him, the doubt accumulated without frame. Erebus had done his work carefully and over a long period in the other legion. Nobody like Erebus was needed on Caliban. Caliban had Luther's wound and the old texts and the years of absence. These were sufficient. The lion's years during the heresy itself are worth dwelling on in some detail, because they illuminate his character in ways that become important when you think about what he returned to find. He fought through the Thramas Crusade, the years-long campaign against Conrad Curzay and the Night Lords that occupied a significant portion of his heresy experience. The Thramas Crusade was a strange kind of. Curzay was a Primarch, genuinely one of the most dangerous single combatants in the galaxy, and he fought the campaign the way the Night Lords always fought, through terror and deception, and the willingness to do things that the Lion found personally repugnant, even in the context of a war that had already produced Istvan Thur and The two of them met in personal combat more than once during the Thramas Crusade. These meetings were not simply battles. They were, in the specific way that Primarch encounters tend to be, also conversations. Because beings of that capability and that intelligence cannot fight each other without simultaneously arguing about what they are fighting for and why. Curzay argued, in his nihilistic way, that the lion was no different from him, that the methods the lion used, the intelligence operations and the targeted eliminations and the careful management of information to achieve strategic outcomes, were the same methods that Curzay used, distinguished only by the ostensibly nobler purposes they were applied to. The lion rejected this argument, but the lion's rejection was characteristically the lion's, which meant it was expressed through action rather than words, through the continued prosecution of the campaign rather than through any extended verbal refutation that might have addressed Curzay's actual point. There is something worth noticing in the lion's response to Curzay's argument, which is that it was not entirely, and the lion was certainly intelligent enough to know it was not entirely wrong. The First Legion's culture of secrecy and information control, the willingness to manage what other people knew and when they knew it, the operational decision-making that took place in inner circles from which even allies were sometimes excluded. These things did share a structural resemblance to Curzay's methods, even if the purposes were radical. The lion knew this, and was uncomfortable with it in the specific way of someone who knows their choices are defensible, but not beyond criticism. He chose the campaign over the argument. He chose demonstration over acknowledgement. He chose, again, the action over the Imperium Secundus came later, in the period when the warp storm created by the Word-Bearer's ritual cut much of the galaxy off from Terra and from the Emperor's guidance. Guilliman, in the part of the galaxy where the signal still reached, took the extraordinary step of declaring a successor state, a continuation of the Imperium's essential functions in the absence of contact with the original. He named Sanguinius as the Emperor in Waiting, a title that the Blood Angel's Primarch accepted with the humility of someone who neither sought nor rejected the burden of leadership, but understood its necessity. The Lion arrived at Imperium Secundus under circumstances that were less straightforward than the other Primarchs. He came with the Night Haunter aboard his flagship, having captured Kurz at the conclusion of the Thramas Crusade, and brought him to what amounted to a war crimes tribunal. The trial that followed was one of the most revealing episodes of the heresy in what it showed about the Primarch's characters. Kurz made his argument. The Lion wanted him executed. Guilliman sought a form of justice that would serve the broader purposes of Imperium Secundus's legitimacy. Sanguinius sought mercy combined with accountability. The conflict between these positions consumed the tribunal and produced an outcome that satisfied no one, which is perhaps the truest thing that can be said about justice attempted in circumstances of total crisis. The Lion's role in Imperium Secundus was as difficult as his role anywhere that required sustained political navigation rather than military decision-making. He was appointed Lord Protector, charged with the military security of the successor state, a role that his capabilities genuinely suited. He was less suited to the constant negotiation between Guilliman's careful governance and Sanguinius's compassionate vision. The Lion's approach to most disagreements was to identify the correct answer, and which worked well in military contexts and less well in political ones where the identification of the correct answer was itself the subject of the disagreement. He clashed with Guilliman repeatedly. He was not wrong necessarily in the specific tactical and strategic positions he took. He was simply operating with a model of decision-making that assumed a level of acknowledged hierarchy that Imperium Secundus's peculiar circumstances did not provide. He eventually left Imperium Secundus under circumstances that the records do not fully clarify. The Dark Angel's accounts suggest he was recalled to other duties by developments that required his presence elsewhere. Other accounts suggest the departure was less formally arrived at. The pattern of the Lion's behavior in situations that require sustained collaborative leadership rather than clear individual authority is consistent across all the accounts of this period. He engages. He achieves significant military results. He finds the collaborative aspect increasingly uncomfortable, and he eventually takes unilateral action in a way that resolves the military situation at the cost of the political relationship. He was heading home when the heresy ended. He was heading toward Caliban, toward the accounting that he perhaps already knew was waiting there, when the final events of the war played out without him. He did not fight at the Siege of Terra. He was not present for Horus's death or the Emperor's wounding. He was en route to a world that was about to destroy itself, carrying the knowledge, or at least the suspicion, that something was very wrong with what he was returning to. The full weight of his return to Caliban is not diminished by having told the story already. It gains weight with each consideration of what it meant. The Lion, who had spent years fighting a war that would have been prevented if Lorgar's wound had been handled differently. If Horus's wound had been handled, who had watched the galaxy tear itself apart over failures of trust and communication, returned to his homeworld to discover that a failure of trust and communication in his own most important relationship had produced a smaller version of the same catastrophe. Caliban was not the galaxy. Luther was not Horus. The First Legion's division was not the Horus heresy. But the structure was the same. The wound had been found and pressed. The darkness had come in through the gap between what was meant and what was understood, and the consequences could not be undone. What the Lion felt in that moment, standing on the bridge of his flagship while the weapons of his own homeworld fired on his fleet, is something the available records do not directly address. The Dark Angel's accounts of the event are written in the language of ritual and necessity, not in the language of personal testimony. There are no accounts from warriors who were close enough to the Lion in that moment to describe what he showed. There are hints in the tactical record of a Primarch who proceeded with the full engagement of his capabilities, but who did not do so with the cold detachment that usually characterized his operational decision-making. The orbital bombardment of Caliban, which proceeded over hours and reduced significant portions of the surface to rubble, was executed with an efficiency that was the Lion's standard, and a thoroughness that went somewhat beyond what the military objectives required. He was punishing something, not the warriors on the surface, who were already being engaged by the military campaign. Something larger and less targeted. The world itself, perhaps, the place that had made both of them, that had produced the extraordinary child in the forest and the man who found him, that had been home to the Order and the libraries and the great beasts, and everything that had preceded the Emperor's arrival and the Lion's departure. He was punishing the place that had given him Luther, and then given Luther back to him broken. Or perhaps not. The Lion is not a Primarch whose inner life is easily read from his actions. Perhaps the thoroughness of the bombardment was purely strategic. Perhaps he had calculated that the infrastructure of Caliban, the fortifications and the manufacturing and the communications, needed to be degraded to a specific level before ground operations could proceed safely. Perhaps the emotion that outside observers might project onto the bombardment scale was not present. This is the difficulty of the Lion. His opacity is genuine. You cannot be certain whether what you are seeing is feeling expressed through action or simply action undertaken for clear operational reasons. He would not tell you. He never tells you. Luther would not tell you either. Not Luther, in the deepest prison of the rock, receives visions. This is one of the most consistent elements of the accounts that have leaked from the Dark Angel's inner traditions. Luther sits in his cell in the dark that never changes, in the chamber that the rock carries in its deepest section like a wound that has calcified around the injury without healing it. And he sees things. What he sees, the Dark Angels have never fully shared, but the fragments that have emerged suggest that what Luther sees is the Lion. Not the Lion as he was, not the Primarch at the height of his power, but the Lion sleeping. The Lion in his healing chamber. The connection between them, whatever it is, whatever the Watchers in the dark make of it or enable in it, runs through the rock's stone and the dark between them and shows Luther the being he wounded. What Luther makes of what he sees is also not fully known. His sanity is not intact in any conventional sense. The accounts of his condition suggest something that is not simply madness, something that has preserved certain facets of his intelligence and his awareness while leaving others entirely inaccessible. He knows who he is. He knows what he did, and he carries it. in the dark and the silence and the absence of anyone who remembers Caliban the way he remembers it. Whether he has found the repentance that the interrogator Chaplain's theology would recognize as valid, or whether he simply exists in a state beyond the framework of repentance and defiance, nobody in the inner circle has stated clearly. He is the oldest fallen, the first fallen, the one whose fall made all the others possible. What he is now is something that the Dark Angels have never fully resolved, and that the Lion's return has made newly urgent. The Unforgiven's successors carry the same inheritance as the original Dark Angels, with some variation in how explicitly they engage with the hunt. The Angels of Absolution take perhaps the most purely theological approach, their doctrine emphasizing the concept of absolution available to any fallen who genuinely repents, maintaining a more explicitly forgiving framework than some of the other Unforgiven chapters. The Angels of Vengeance are perhaps the most ferocious in their pursuit, their name reflecting a tradition that places more emphasis on the punishment aspect of the accounting than on the reconciliation aspect. The disciples of Caliban maintain the closest connection to the specific cultural traditions of the homeworld that no longer exists, preserving practices and disciplines that go back to Luther's order in ways that carry a particular poignancy given what the order eventually produced. All of them know the secret. All of them participate in the hunt. All of them have made, across their own histories, the same calculation that the original survivors of Caliban's destruction made, that the secret is too dangerous to release, that the fallen are too valuable a source of information and too dangerous a source of exposure to be left to anyone else's handling, that the Unforgiven are the only appropriate custodians of both the hunt and the truth. This calculation was made, in each case, by warriors who were told the truth only after they had already committed to the organization that held it. They were not given the choice of whether to join a secret society before knowing what the secret was. They were told the secret as a consequence of having already proven themselves worthy of the inner circle's trust, which means the decision to maintain the secret was always made in circumstances that made the alternative very difficult to choose. This is how institutions reproduce themselves across generations, not through force, through the selection and socialization of members who have already demonstrated the qualities the institution values, and who receive the institution's deepest secrets only after the relationship is established enough that betraying those secrets would require betraying everything that the Unforgiven have maintained their secret across 10 millennia through exactly this mechanism. And the mechanism works with a completeness that has impressed even those inquisitors who find the result troubling. The questions that follow from this, the questions that an honest examination of the Dark Angel's situation produces, are not comfortable ones for the Imperium's institutions. If the Dark Angels have been demonstrably loyal for 10,000 years, if their battlefield record is without blemish, and their commitment to the Emperor's service is genuine, does it matter that they have maintained a secret of this scale? Does the secret's content justify the measures taken to protect it? Is the Imperium better served by a chapter that is fully honest about its history and faces the consequence, or by a chapter that has hidden its shame and channeled the energy of that shame into 10,000 years of relentless service? There are serious people who argue for the second position, that the Dark Angel's secret, whatever the moral complexity of maintaining it, has produced an institution of extraordinary effectiveness whose operational value to the Imperium exceeds the damage done by the deception. That the alternatives, the disbanding of the chapter, The public disclosure of the fallen, the inquisitorial investigation that would follow such disclosure, would produce outcomes worse than continued secrecy. These arguments are not without weight. They are simply not the kind of arguments that produce honest relationships. And honest relationships, as the lion's story makes clear, are not a luxury but a structural requirement for the long-term health of anything that depends on trust. The Dark Angels serve the Emperor. They have always served the Emperor, even through the secret, even through the moments when the secret required them to act in ways that served their own institutional interests rather than the Emperor's. They serve with a commitment and a capability that is matched by very few organizations they are, in the fullest military sense, exactly what the First Legion was always meant to be. And they are also carrying something that the First Legion was never meant to carry. A burden that was placed on them by circumstances they did not choose, and that has shaped them over 10,000 years into something that the lion, returning from his long sleep, must look at with complicated feelings. The lion does not show complicated feelings. Not externally. He has never shown complicated feelings externally. This is the thing about him that has not changed. That the sleep of 10 millennia did not alter. That the healing that the Watchers in the Dark provided did not address. He is still the lion. Still cold. Still brilliant. Still more comfortable demonstrating things than saying them. Still the being who sent Luther home instead of finding the words to explain what he meant by it. But there are accounts, carefully controlled, filtered through multiple layers of Dark Angels tradition before anything like them reaches the outside world, suggesting that something in his demeanor has changed. Not the fundamental character. Not the opacity or the strategic clarity or the cold assessment that has always defined him. Something in the way he looks at what he created, at the chapter that carries his name and his gene seed. Something that was not there in the accounts of his behavior during the Great Crusade, in the records of the Thramas Crusade and Imperium Secundus and the years of the heresy. Something that might, if you were being unguarded in your interpretation, be recognized as grief. Not performed grief, not the kind of grief that is expressed in ceremony or in the formal recognition of loss, the quieter, more internal kind. The grief of a being who has been shown the full consequences of something he did long ago and understands them in a way that he could not have understood them at the time. Because at the time he was too close to the choice to see where it led. He sent Luther home instead of saying what he meant, and the galaxy paid for it, and 10,000 years have not made the debt any smaller, only more clearly measurable. Every fallen angel who has been recovered and interrogated in the centuries since Caliban is, in some sense, the lion's debt. Every mission abandoned, every planetary defense compromised, every moment when the Dark Angels chose the secret over the mission is, in some sense, the lion's responsibility. He would not say this. It is not in his nature to say it, any more than it was in his nature to say the things he should have said to Luther. But the accounts suggest he knows it. The cold calculation that was always his primary mode of engagement with the world has, in the current age, been joined by something else. Something that functions in the space where accounting and acknowledgement overlap. He has returned from sleep to a galaxy that needs him. And he has returned to a chapter that has been living inside the consequences of his choices. And the return has not been for the lion simply the resumption of a mission interrupted. It has been something more like a reckoning. The Dark Angels fight in the darkness of the current age with everything they have. They fight in the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the Imperium that the Great Rift has cut off from the light of the Astronomicon, where the darkness is not metaphorical but literal. A region of space where warp storms rage and demonic presence is amplified, and the normal rules of void travel and communication apply only intermittently. They fight alongside the wider Imperium when the needs of the war bring them into contact with forces that do not share their secret and do not know what they carry. They fight with the characteristic Dark Angel's precision and discipline, and that specific quality of ferocity that comes from warriors who are not simply fighting an enemy, but working off a debt. The Ravenwing ranges through the galaxy, always moving, following trails that the interrogator chaplains have identified and the scouts have confirmed, pushing toward the locations where fallen have been sighted. The Deathwing deploys in the Terminator armor of the chapter's first company, the veterans of the veterans, the warriors who have been told the full truth and have incorporated it into the understanding of what their purpose is. The bulk of the chapter, the warriors who know only what they need to know, fight with the competence and dedication that the First Legion's gene seed and training produce as a matter of course. And in the rock, moving through its corridors and its deep chambers, with the unhurried certainty of beings who have been present since before the chapter was formed, the Watchers in the Dark continue their inexplicable attendance on the matters of the First Legion. What they are, the Watchers in the Dark, is one of the questions that the Dark Angels' inner circle has never definitively answered even among themselves. They predate the Order. They were present on Caliban before Luther's Brotherhood existed, in the forests that the Order's histories describe as haunted by things other than the great beasts, things smaller and stranger that were never fully classified or confronted. They may be remnants of whatever intelligence Caliban harbored before human civilization arrived. They may be connected to the same ancient forces that placed the lion in the forest in the first place, the same currents that scattered the Primarchs from the Emperor's laboratories. They may be something else entirely, something that the available frameworks of the Imperium are not equipped to categorize. They are present. They persist. They tend the lion. They attend the chapter. They watch, as their name suggests, in the dark. The sword is still in Cypher's hands. If the most recent accounts are to be believed, Cypher has been observed in the current age in locations that place him closer to terror than his previous movements have suggested. Whether this represents a convergence toward the destination that the most optimistic interpretations of his behavior have always pointed at, the Emperor's throne room, the presentation of the blade, the accounting that can only be given to the one it is owed to, or whether it represents something else entirely, is a question that cannot yet be answered. The Dark Angels are hunting him. They have always been hunting him. He has evaded them for 10,000 years and continues to evade them with a facility that suggests either extraordinary fortune or extraordinary capability, or both. The blade, if it is the lion's blade, belongs to the lion. The lion is awake. The accounting toward which the Dark Angels have been building for 10,000 years is perhaps closer than it has ever been. Not because all the fallen have been recovered, they have not, but because the being to whom the accounting was always ultimately owed is no longer sleeping. Whatever resolution is available to the story of Caliban and Luther and the First Legion's long shame, the precondition for it the lion's presence is now met. Whether resolution is possible is a different question. The Dark Angels do not use that word. They use different words: redemption, forgiveness, absolution, the completion of the accounting. These words are not quite the same as resolution, and the difference matters. Resolution implies that something can be made right, that the original harm can be addressed in a way that returns things to a state of wholeness. The harm of Caliban, the loss of the world and the scattering of the fallen, and the wound in Luther and the wound in the lion and the 10,000 years of everything that followed, cannot be resolved in that sense. It is too large and too old and too thoroughly woven into what the First Legion is. What is possible, and what the current age seems to be building toward in ways that the Dark Angels themselves may not entirely see from the inside, is something more modest and more real than resolution. The possibility of honesty. Not the complete disclosure of everything, not the end of all secrets, not the public accounting before the Inquisition and the wider Imperium of every dark corner of Caliban's history. Those outcomes may be neither possible nor desirable, but honesty in the smaller, more personal sense. The lion telling the people around him what he means rather than expecting them to read his actions correctly. The inner circle deciding that the burden they have been carrying alone is too heavy to carry alone indefinitely, and finding ways to share it within the boundaries of what is safe. The acknowledgement, within the chapter itself, that what the Dark Angels are is the product not just of 10,000 years of faithful service, but of 10,000 years of faithful service inside a wound that has never been allowed to fully close. This is the dark secret of the Dark Angels, held in the deepest vault of the Sorrow Archive that the galaxy's most dangerous and most honest institution has devoted itself to maintaining. Not the events. The events are known, at least in their outlines. The secret is the understanding of what the events reveal, which is that the most ancient and the most honored of the Emperor's chapters has been shaped as much by a failure of love as by any of the galaxy's enemies. That the First Legion's greatest wound was not struck by chaos, though chaos exploited it. The wound was struck by silence, by the simple and irreparable absence of words between two beings who needed to say them and did not. The Dark Angels march in the darkness of the current age, carrying their secret, hunting their fallen, fighting the enemies of the Emperor with the full commitment and the extraordinary capability that 10,000 years of the First Legion's tradition have built into them. They are the unforgiven. They have not forgiven themselves. They are still waiting for the accounting to be completed, for the last fallen to repent or defy, for the debt to be paid and the record to be closed. But the lion is awake, and perhaps, in this age that has brought back what the age before it thought was gone forever, the words that were never spoken on Caliban might finally find a way to be said. Perhaps the fire that has been burning in the rock's deepest chambers for 10,000 years, tended by the watchers in the dark who have been waiting as long as they have been watching, is approaching the moment when it provides light rather than simply warmth. Perhaps the Dark Angels do not speak in certainties about the future. They have been in the dark too long for that. They know what the dark contains, how it preserves, and how it distorts, how secrets kept long enough become different from what they started as. They know the weight of 10,000 years of silence. They know the cost of wounds that are hidden rather than healed. They know all of this, and they keep the secret still. And they fight on, and the lion moves through the corridors of the rock with the quiet, contained. Terrible certainty of a being who has returned to a galaxy that needs him and found, in the chapter that carries his name, the full weight of the thing he could not say. The First Legion fights on. The unforgiven endure. The sword remains undrawn. And the dark secret of the Dark Angels is not only what they are hiding, it is what they have been showing, all along, in the shape of their obsession and the architecture of their shame. The secret is written in everything they do, and it says, in the language that the lion has always spoken, the language of action over declaration, we have not forgotten what we owe. We have not forgotten who we hurt. We have not forgotten Caliban and Luther, and the words that were not spoken, and the galaxy that changed because they were not spoken. We remember, we always remember. We are the First Legion. We remember everything except how to say it out loud. That is the dark secret of the Dark Angels, not a fact. A wound. A wound 10,000 years deep, shaped like the silence between two beings who should have known better, carried by 1,000,000 warriors across 1,000,000 battlefields in the name of a Primarch who has finally, at the end of everything, woken up to find the wound still there. Waiting, as it has always waited, for the words that might begin to close it, if they ever come. That is the dark secret of the Dark Angels, not a fact. A wound 10,000 years deep, shaped like the silence between two beings who should have known better, carried by 1,000,000 warriors across 1,000,000 battlefields in the name of a Primarch who has finally, at the end of everything, woken up to find the wound still there. Waiting, as it has always waited, for the words that might begin to close it, if they ever come. The rock moves through the void with a presence that unsettles the crews of ships that pass near it. Not because it looks dangerous, though it does. Not because the defenses it carries are visible, though they are formidable. Because of something harder to name. A quality that the void sailors and the naval officers who have served in proximity to it describe in consistent terms that suggest they are not simply making up an appropriate atmosphere. The rock feels old in a way that other vessels, even the oldest grand cruisers of the Imperial Navy, do not feel old. It feels old the way that places feel old when the weight of what happened in them has not been fully discharged. It is a haunted thing, in the most literal and also the most figurative sense available to a universe that contains actual ghosts, and also the metaphorical haunting of history, pressing on the present through the medium of unresolved events. It is, after all, a world. Or it was, the largest fragment of Caliban that survived the storm, the piece of the planet that the Dark Angels have been living inside for 10,000 years, carries with it the physical memory of the world it was part of. The stone of the rock is Caliban's stone. The deep passages that the chapter has cut through it and built within it are passages through the substance of the world that produced both the lion and Luther. The world where the Order fought the great beasts and the libraries accumulated their wisdom and their contamination. The world where a child emerged from the deep forest and changed the history of the galaxy. The rock is all that is left of Caliban, and when you understand what Caliban was, the rock's quality of haunting becomes less mysterious. The watchers in the dark move through the rock's passages in the way that things move when they have always been present. Not intruding, not alien, despite the certainty that they are, in some meaningful sense. Not human. They are simply there, as they have always been there, going about whatever it is they go about in the hours and days and years, when they are not visibly attending to the ceremonies and rituals that have come to define their role in the chapter's life. They communicate, when they communicate at all, through gesture and through the objects they carry and sometimes place in significant locations. They have never, in the recorded history of the Dark Angels, spoken in any language that any member of the chapter has been able to identify. Whether they can speak, whether the concept of spoken language is something their nature accommodates, is not known. What is known is that they are connected to the lion in some way that goes beyond the simple caretaker function that their role in his recovery implies. They were present on Caliban before the lion was found in the forest. Whether they were present before the human settlements were built is a question that the oldest Calibanite traditions touch on and do not answer clearly. Whether they are, in some sense, native to Caliban in the way that the great beasts were native to Caliban, products of the same ancient conditions that made the forest what it was, is a possibility that the Dark Angel's inner circle has considered and not been able to rule out. Whether they are something else entirely, something that came to Caliban from outside in the same mysterious way that the lion came to Caliban, is another possibility that similarly cannot be ruled out. They are, by the most honest available summary, genuinely unknown, and the Dark Angels' comfort with this state of genuine unknowing about one of their most consistent companions is itself revealing. An institution that has made peace with not knowing what the Watchers in the Dark are is an institution that has developed a particular relationship with the limits of understanding. The rock's deepest chambers are not accessible to most members of the Dark Angels. Not even to most members of the inner circle. There is a sequence of descending access, each level requiring a higher rank and a more complete knowledge of the chapter's history. And at the bottom of this sequence are chambers that only the Supreme Grand Master and the most senior interrogator chaplains and the Watchers in the Dark themselves can enter. What is in these chambers, beyond the Lion and Luther, is not publicly known. The Inner Circle's accounts suggest there are records, archives of the hunt, that go back to the immediate aftermath of Caliban's destruction, the accumulated intelligence of 10,000 years of tracking the fallen. There are artifacts, objects recovered from fallen who were taken or from locations associated with Caliban's history. There are things that the Watchers in the Dark have placed there, whose nature and origin and purpose the chapter has catalogued without understanding. Luther's cell is in these deepest chambers. The accounts that have filtered out suggest it is not a traditional prison, not a space of deliberate austerity designed to punish. It is, by the descriptions available, simply a room. Not comfortable, but not intentionally uncomfortable. A space in which a being who has nowhere to go sits and exists and receives whatever comes to him in the silence. The visions come regularly, by these accounts. The lion in his healing sleep, visible to Luther through whatever connection exists between them. Whether the lion was aware of being seen during the years of his sleep is not known. Whether Luther's vigil over the sleeping Primarch represented something like penance, the man who struck the wound watching over the wound's healing, is a matter of interpretation. Luther has not spoken coherently to the warriors who have attempted to interrogate him since the period immediately following his capture. In the early years after Caliban's, when the first interrogator chaplains attempted to process him as they would any fallen, he spoke. What he said in those early sessions has been classified at the highest level of Dark Angel's secrecy. and has not been shared even within the inner circle beyond a very small number of its most senior members. The accounts of those sessions that have survived in any accessible form describe a man who had not lost his intelligence or his articulateness, who spoke in complete sentences about coherent subjects, who demonstrated a full understanding of what he had done and why it was wrong, but who also spoke of things that the interrogators could not categorize, visions and understandings that appeared to be genuine rather than delusional, but that had no frame of reference in the Dark Angel's existing theology. After a certain point, Luther stopped speaking in ways that the interrogator chaplains could work with. He did not fall silent. Exactly, he continued to speak, but in ways that were not responsive to the questions being asked of him, that followed their own logic without reference to the therapeutic or theological goals of the interrogation, whether this represented a genuine collapse of the coherence that the earlier sessions had shown, or a deliberate withdrawal from a process that he had decided was not giving him what he needed, is a question that the Dark Angels have been sitting with for a very long time. The question of what Luther needs is one that the Dark Angels' theology is not well equipped to answer, because the theology was built around extracting repentance from the fallen, not around understanding the specific pastoral needs of the most complex and most ancient fallen that the chapter possesses. Luther is not simply a traitor who needs to be brought to account. He is the father of the thing that destroyed Caliban, the man whose wound the Chaos Powers found and used, the former master of the Order who gave the lion everything and was given back something that looked like everything and felt like nothing. He is also, by the accounts that filter out of those early coherent sessions, a man who genuinely understood what he had done and genuinely mourned it, not in the way of a man performing, but in the way of a man who had looked at the full scope of the consequences of his choices and found them genuinely unbearable to contemplate. Whether that mourning constitutes the repentance the Dark Angels' theology requires is a question that their tradition has never satisfactorily resolved. The repentance they seek from fallen angels is a specific kind of acknowledgement, a formal recognition of guilt offered to the lion or to his representatives. Luther's mourning, by the accounts available, preceded any such offering, was genuine and deep, and entirely unadministered by the interrogator chaplain's process. Whether genuine mourning that precedes a formal accounting is better or worse than formally extracted repentance that may or may not represent genuine feeling is a theological question that the inner circle discusses and does not agree on. The Dark Angels tradition emphasizes the formal element, the spoken acknowledgement, in ways that may reflect the same inability to read genuine internal states from external behavior that characterized the lion himself. It is entirely possible that Luther repented in the deepest possible way in the hours after Caliban's destruction, that the collapse into apparent incoherence was the aftermath of a genuine and total reckoning rather than a breakdown, and that the chapter has been managing a penitent who completed his penitence before the penitence was officially received for 10,000. The lion's return has created a situation in which this question can no longer be deferred indefinitely. Luther is present. The lion is present. Whatever needed to happen between them in the original reckoning that the destruction of Caliban interrupted has been deferred for 10,000 years. It cannot be deferred for 10,000 more. The bodies of beings with Primarch-level physiology do not have a biological lifespan in the conventional sense. But Luther's condition, whatever it is not stable. The accounts suggest it has been changing in the years since the Lion's awakening, in ways that the Watchers in the Dark have noted, and that the Inner Circle has been monitoring with the attention they give to things that are both important and beyond their full understanding. The Deathwing carries its burden differently from and understanding the difference matters for understanding what the hunt is actually doing to the chapter that conducts it. The Ravenwing's burden is operational. It is the burden of warriors who know what they are looking for and are organized around the finding of it, whose purpose is defined by the specific objective of locating the fallen before anyone else does. It is an intense and absorbing burden, but it is a burden that can be partially discharged in action. When the Ravenwing identifies and tracks a fallen angel to a location that allows the Deathwing to close and make the recovery, they have done what they are for. The satisfaction of that completion, the sense of purpose fulfilled, is available to the Ravenwing in ways that the Deathwing's burden does not fully provide. The Deathwing carries the truth, all of it, or as much of it as a living warrior of the current age can hold. The knowledge of what happened on Caliban and why. The knowledge of what the chapter has been doing for 10,000 years and what the knowledge of the Lion and Luther and the sword and cipher and the unresolved accounting. The Deathwing are the warriors who know why the secret matters, who have been trusted with the full weight of it, and who carry that weight alongside everything else that a Space Marine of the First Legion is required to carry. The knowledge does not make them weaker. It does not undermine their commitment to the chapter's service, but it changes the quality of what they are carrying into combat. The Deathwing go to war knowing that the war is not simply about the external enemy. It is also, and more fundamentally, about the internal reckoning that the chapter has been working toward for 10,000 years. Every engagement they survive is another step in the long accounting. Every recovery they make is another small reduction of the debt. The burden of knowing this, the weight of 10,000 years of history and shame and service, gives the Deathwing a quality that observers have consistently described as gravity. A heaviness, not of spirit exactly, something more like an awareness of the full cost of what they are doing, carried in the bearing and the gaze and the way they occupy space in the world. The interrogator chaplains are perhaps the most complex figures in the Dark Angels institution, precisely because their role is the one that most directly confronts the gap between what the chapter's theology says should be happening and what actually happens when human beings, even superhuman beings, are subjected to sustained psychological engagement in conditions of power imbalance. They are skilled. The consistency of their methods and the quality of their results, when judged by the chapter's internal standards, is high. They extract repentance when it is extractable. They identify defiance when it is genuine. They differentiate with considerable accuracy between fallen who are genuinely corrupted by chaos and fallen who have spent 10,000 years in the galaxy trying not to be found and have arrived at places that the chaos corruption of the original event does not entirely explain. Because some of the fallen are not, by the time they are found, what they were. Some of them turned on Caliban in ways that were genuine and deep and carried whatever power the corrupted texts had given them, and the genuine conviction that the Emperor's project was flawed beyond redemption. Some of them turned on Caliban in ways that were less certain, following Luther because Luther was who Luther was, and the alternative was fighting against someone they had trusted more than they had trusted their distant Primarch. Some of them emerged from the warp storm that destroyed Caliban in centuries and eras far from their own, into a galaxy that had already moved on from the heresy, into contexts where the choice that had defined them was ancient history, and the specific texture of what they had been was no longer available to them in the same way. Some of them built lives in the galaxy's vast and unmonitored margins that had nothing to do with chaos and everything to do with simple survival in the complicated space between Caliban's destruction and the present. When the interrogator chaplains find these fallen, the ones who have been living for centuries or millennia as something other than what they were on Caliban, the interrogation is a different thing from what the theology describes. The theology describes the drawing out of repentance from a fallen who is still, in some meaningful sense, the warrior who stood on Caliban with Luther and fired on the returning, but a warrior who spent the first millennium after Caliban's destruction as a mercenary on the rim worlds of the Eastern Fringe, and the second millennium as a wandering healer on worlds that had no idea what a space marine was, and the third millennium fighting against actual chaos cults on a world that needed someone with his capabilities and his training, is not simply the warrior who stood on Caliban. He is also everything that happened after Caliban, and the interrogation that treats him as if the intervening experience does not exist is engaging with only part of what he is. The best of the interrogator chaplains understand this. They engage with the full person, not just the historical event. They work with the specifics of what each fallen has become in the time since the fall, what they have built and what they have lost, and what they carry from the original event alongside everything the years have added to it. The best sessions are, by the accounts that filter out of the Dark Angel's restricted record, something closer to genuine pastoral conversations than to interrogations in any conventional sense. Encounters between skilled practitioners of human psychology and beings who have had centuries to think about who they are and what they did and what it means. These sessions are also often the most productive in terms of the theological outcome the chapter is looking for, which is perhaps not coincidental. Genuine repentance, as opposed to extracted repentance, tends to come from genuine engagement with the full person rather than from pressure applied to the historical event. The fallen who encounter the worst of the interrogator chaplain's practice. The sessions driven by the chapter's institutional need to complete the accounting rather than by genuine engagement with the specific fallen they are dealing with are the ones most likely to produce defiance rather than repentance. A fallen who is treated as nothing more than an item in the chapter's ledger, a debt to be collected and resolved, will respond to that treatment with the same pride and stubbornness that made him capable of standing against the returning fleet in the first place. The warrior who turned on Caliban was, whatever his specific motivations, someone of considerable will and independence. That will and independence does not evaporate in the interrogator chaplain's chamber. It goes somewhere, and where it goes depends on what it meets. Mera Astellan is among the more extensively documented of the fallen who have been recovered, and whose account has filtered through the Dark Angel's security apparatus to produce at least a partial external record. A commander on Caliban, who was among those who followed Luther, and who has provided, through the interrogation process, accounts of the events on Caliban from the perspective of someone who was present, and who made choices whose reasons he has been willing, at least partially, to articulate. His accounts suggest a Caliban that is more morally complex than the simple narrative of corruption and fall would accommodate. A garrison that was fractured not because everyone on it was in the grip of chaos, but because the circumstances they were placed in made the fracture almost inevitable, and because the information available to them did not allow them to make the choices they might have made with better. Information. Astellan's perspective is not the Dark Angel's perspective, and the Dark Angels have not treated his accounts as authoritative. He is a fallen, and the Dark Angel's theology is not structured around giving fallen a platform. But his perspective, precisely because it is the perspective of someone who was there and who has had considerable time to reflect on what being there meant, contains information that a complete account of what happened on Caliban requires. The Dark Angels possess his account. What they do with it, how much weight they give it against the narrative of the hunt that has organized their existence for 10,000 years, is part of the internal reckoning that the Lion's return has made more urgent. The question of what the Imperium would do, if it knew everything, is one that the Dark Angels have been treating as a reason to maintain the secret. It is worth asking, though, whether this assessment is correct. The Imperium of the current age is not the Imperium of the immediate post-heresy period, in which the Inquisition was at its most aggressive, and the paranoia generated by the heresy's revelation of what trusted warriors could do was at its most acute. 10,000 years have passed. The Imperium has survived things that, in the immediate aftermath of the heresy, might have seemed as threatening to its existence as the heresy itself was. It has accumulated, across those 10,000 years, a capacity for accommodating complexity that the newly formed institutions of the post-heresy period did not have. The Dark Angel's secret, disclosed honestly to the current Inquisition, would not produce a result as simple as the chapter's suppression. It might produce an investigation. It might produce restrictions on certain operational practices. It might produce requirements for increased transparency around the hunt's activities. These outcomes would be unpleasant for the chapter. They would require adjustments to practices that have become deeply embedded in the institutional culture. They would require a kind of accountability that the Dark Angels have not been accustomed to accepting. They would not, however, end the chapter's existence or its ability to serve the Emperor. The First Legion's record of service is extensive enough and clean enough that no honest accounting of that record alongside the honest accounting of the Calibanite secret would produce a conclusion of fundamental disloyalty. The Dark Angels continue to keep the secret, not because disclosure would be fatal to the chapter, but because the habit of keeping it is so deeply embedded that the calculation of what would happen if it ended is no longer being made on its actual merits. The secret is what the Dark Angels do. The hunt is what they are. These things have become definitional in ways that make the question of whether they remain necessary feel somehow beside the point. This is how institutions become defined by their most distinctive practices, through the gradual migration of those practices from means to identity. The secret began as a means to protect the chapters. It became, over centuries and millennia, the defining feature of the chapter's identity. Changing it now would require the chapter to understand itself differently, which is among the most difficult things any institution can do. The Lion's return may be the catalyst for exactly this difficulty, not because he has announced any intention to end the secret or to change the chapter's practices. He has made no such announcements. He does not make announcements in general, but because his presence in the rock and in the current age and in the campaigns he has rejoined is changing the conditions under which the practices exist. The hierarchy of partial truths that the inner circle maintained was organized, at its apex, around a sleeping Primarch whose will and intentions had to be inferred from tradition and symbol. The hierarchy exists now with a waking Primarch who has his own opinions and his own counsel and his own ways of expressing them. These are not the same thing. A sleeping king whose authority is invoked to maintain a system is a different kind of authority than a waking king who can tell you what he actually thinks. What the lion actually thinks remains, characteristically, something that must be inferred from what he does rather than from what he says. He fights. He leads. He makes decisions with the same cold, strategic clarity that he has always brought to decisions. He is present in the chapter's operations in ways that his absence for 10,000 years made impossible. And in the spaces between the operations, in the moments when the war is briefly less immediate, there are accounts of him descending into the rock's deepest chambers, through the levels of access, past the inner circle's domain, and past the interrogator Chaplain's cells, and into the deepest places where the watchers in the dark walk their inexplicable rounds. What happens in those deepest chambers when the lion is there is not in any record accessible to anyone outside the very innermost level of the Dark Angel's hierarchy. Whether he has visited Luther, whether the two of them have had the conversation that they did not have on Caliban, that they could not have on Caliban because the time ran out before the words could, whether the lion has found in the 10,000 years of healing sleep and whatever the watchers in the dark provided in the way of reflection, the capacity to say to the man he loved and failed the thing that he could not say before the fall, whether Luther in his current state is able to receive it if it is said. These are the questions that the Dark Angel's story is currently in the process of answering, and they are the questions that make the current age genuinely significant for the First Legion in a way that goes beyond the military significance of the lion's return to a galaxy that needs him. The lion returning to fight is important. The lion returning to speak is more important. Not because speaking is superior to fighting, because the thing that broke Caliban was silence, and the thing that might begin to heal the wound is its opposite, and the First Legion has been waiting for 10,000 years for the right moment. And the right moment, whatever else is true about the galaxy in which they find themselves, has finally arrived. The Dark Angels are the unforgiven. They have named themselves thus for 10,000 years. Unforgiven because the fallen have not been fully recovered. Unforgiven because the accounting is not complete. Unforgiven because the debt is still being carried in the silence of the rock and the obsessive pursuit of the hunt and the hierarchy of secrets that organizes everything they do. But forgiveness in the truest sense is not something that is extracted from the person who has done harm. It is something that is offered by the person who was harmed. And the person who was most deeply harmed by everything that happened on Caliban and in the years that led to it is the one who now moves through the rock's passages under the watchful stillness of the watchers in the dark. The one who has been in the deepest chamber for 10,000 years. And who has just woken up to find the galaxy changed, and the accounting still up. The Dark Angels are waiting to complete the accounting so they can be forgiven. They may have misunderstood for 10,000 years who the forgiveness needs to come from. They have been hunting the fallen to bring them to the lion. They may need to consider whether the lion's own accounting, the one he owes to the galaxy and to Luther and to the men who fell on Caliban because the words were not spoken, is as much a part of what needs to happen as anything the interrogator chaplains can extract in the cells beneath the rock. The First Legion, the unforgiven, the Dark Angels, they carry their secret, they hunt their fallen, they serve the Emperor with everything they have. And in the deepest chamber of the world that destroyed itself to make them what they are, the fire burns low, and the watchers and the lion is awake. The words are coming, or they are not. And in the silence between those two possibilities, the galaxy turns, and the Dark Angels march, and the secret that has been with them since the day after Caliban endures, faithful and patient and heavy as stone, as it has always endured, as perhaps it will not always endure. That is the dark secret of the Dark Angels, and that is the story of the First Legion, told as honestly as the subject permits, which is to say imperfectly, with gaps, with things that remain unknown and things that remain deliberately hidden, and things that even the most thorough accounting cannot fully illuminate. Some secrets are kept even from the telling of their own. Perhaps that is the most Dark Angels thing about the Dark Angels story, that even in its most complete available version, there are things that cannot be said. Things that are known to exist and that the available evidence gestures toward without reaching. Things in the deepest chambers that only the Lion and the Watchers in the Dark and perhaps Luther know, and that none of them are currently sharing. The silence endures, the dark endures, the angels of the dark endure, as they have always endured, as they will endure. Until the last fallen repents or defies, until the accounting is complete, until the Lion and Luther finally say to each other what should have been said on Caliban before the guns fired and the storm came and everything was lost. The First Legion waits. The unforgiven endure. The secret for now. And so the record stands, incomplete and enduring, as all true records of the First Legion must stand.